and unveil the book History That India Ignored.
Good evening, everybody. Our very revered Prem Prakash ji, Sanjeev ji, and Kirwai bhai, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, I think a week or so back when I received a message that Prem Prakash ji wanted me to be there for the book release, I asked them to check. I said they may be mistaken because I am too small to perform that task for him. Because he's been such a tall figure and a source of inspiration for almost 3 generations of Indians, including me. But nevertheless, I think more than being an honor, it's also going to be a learning experience for a lot of us. And I'm sure everybody over here sitting in this room would agree with that. Now, this book, History That India Ignored, in fact, to tell you honestly, being a voracious reader, I have read hundreds and hundreds of books, and I still have with me, which are dedicated to the independence of India, to the partition of India, and also dedicated exclusively to the 20th century history of India. And books by different authors, by Indian authors, by Pakistani authors, by British authors, by victims of partition who got uprooted from that side and came down to settle here, including the city of Delhi, because it's just about 7 lakh population in 1947. Suddenly overnight it's suddenly up to 11 lakh, such an influx. Also books written by the victims who had to move out from this part and went there in the newly established Pakistan. Also books written by some of those partition displaced persons who chose to settle neither in India nor in Pakistan. In fact, only about a year back, a young journalist, a lady journalist based out of London, came out with a collection of anecdotes after having done some research among the families settled over there in UK, most of them from the erstwhile Punjab. And but why I'm saying so is that, having said that, Prem Prakash ji had a unique advantage, and he was also blessed with a unique privilege in that he had lived history, he had witnessed history, he had reported history, and he had recorded history. So I think more ways than one, he was qualified to perform this task. And I wonder why it didn't occur to his mind earlier. But I'm glad that he's done this now, and he has decided to benefit us with the first-hand evidence account supported by documents, data, dates. And this 253-page book is going to be useful in more than one ways. I always carry 2 books with me, even on the air flight. And that's because I pick up any new book which is available in the market, and then after a couple of pages, I decide whether to read on or not, and just abandon it and take up the new one, next one. So I'm glad that day 4 and yesterday, in 2 of my flights, this was a very comfortable and a very educative companion for me. At the same time, this book would also be useful for all those who wish to acquaint themselves with the chronology of events that led on or that shaped the face of the 20th century primarily, the 20th century India, and also shaped the destiny of India leading up to the midnight of freedom, and particularly so for the new generation which may still not have been touched with the all that went through those who were part of that time when the partition happened. And thirdly, this is also going to be a useful reference book for all the scholars of history. And I'm sure that is going to give it a timeless value. Now, the book also has certain facts reported with, of course, evidence, which have often not been written because most of the authors have tended to look at this entire sequence of events from their perspective, sometimes also from the experiences, the kind of experiences, varied experience they went through, which may have determined their perspective, which of course can't grade them for being biased, but each one had to go through a different kind of a nightmare. In fact, I got my Urdu lessons informally from Professor Jagannath Azad, who is no more, and who always used to tell me fondly that the first national anthem of Pakistan was written by him. And in the midnight of 14th August, when the anthem was playing, some of his Muslim neighbors came over and said, now this is high time you should move out of Lahore, otherwise we would not be able to protect you. And then, of course, the next anthem was written by Hafiz Jalandhari, and so on and so forth. So those who have not been able to be in contact with either those who had gone through that or have themselves been, I think would also be, and many of us, of some of the facts which were lesser reported. Like, for example, in the preface of the book itself, on page number 19, Prem Prakash ji writes, till 1930, the demand of the Congress party was only for home rule, under the status of a dominion of British Empire, with the British monarch appointing a Governor General, end quote. Now, this is something which is going to trigger quite a few heads. In other words, means that however much the Congress party might claim to be the torchbearer of India's freedom struggle, its freedom struggle, if at all, on record, began only after 1930. And if you put it another way, because I'm also a scientist and a researcher, the entire span leading up to independence is only 17 years, out of which 4 years is the Second War. The high point was the Quit India movement 1942, and that means only for 1 decade the Congress party was apparently active as freedom fighters. But the drum beating has successfully carried on for almost a century now. And that is where the title of the book finds its justification, History That India Ignored. And when I was reading this, the first thought that occurred to my mind was that 1930 was exactly the year when Bhagat Singh and his colleagues were being tried in Lahore court. And they were hanged in 1931. And they were precisely agitating for this reason, that it has not to be a dominion state, it has to be an independent state. So see the entire contradiction happening. I don't know how much we celebrate Bhagat Singh and others as we do others. And 1930 was this year when two dichotomies were simultaneously happening in this country. And Bhagat Singh and his colleagues found no support from the Congress party, which was founded by W.O. Hume. And in fact, when he founded it, his main idea was he was of course a retired British civil servant, and his idea was to have India being ruled by some of the civil servants who had chosen to stay back in India, along with the new emerging English-speaking elite, so that he could keep the officers coming from outside away from the reins of power. And there was a different kind of an agent and an intention over there, which was far, far away from the concept, idea, or desire for independence. And Prem Prakash ji uses a very fascinating sentence describing this newly formed Congress party of those times. He writes, and I quote, "It was indeed a club of retiring civil servants and emerging India elite," end quote. So that's how he has looked at it. And he wishes us to understand what's it all about. On the same page, there's another interesting anecdote, which is of course known to many of us, may not be known to many across the country and across the length and breadth of this peninsula, is that when soon after independence, the then Prime Minister on a visit was in Calcutta, Chief Justice P.N. Chakravarti of the Calcutta High Court, who was at that point in time also officiating as the Governor of Bengal, asked him what finally triggered the decision of the British Empire to quit India or to leave India. Was it that they could not handle Gandhi and the Congress? And the Attlee's reply is an eye-opener. And this has been quoted in the book. Attlee's reply was, and I quote, "The role of Gandhi and Congress was minimal, as there was no agitation by them on the horizon. And therefore, the conclusion drawn by Prem Prakash Ji is that what spurred the British to leave was possibly, as I understand, and he is trying to put out, is A, the decision by Subhash Chandra Bose to put up the Indian National Army, B, the mutiny by the Royal Indian Navy in Bombay. Now, of course, fancifully, all the names have been changed except Delhi, still surviving, Mumbai. And the third was the massive public protest that was being witnessed across the country for these three officers of the INA, namely Shah Nawaz Khan, P.S. Sehgal, and G.S. Dhillon. So what is being sought to be made out, that what was creating ripples in the foundations of the British Empire was all that was being done outside the realms of what was being made out by a small coterie of the more projected ones. Then another myth which is sought to be exploded by the book is, on page number 23 of the preface, the first war of independence is very popularly referred to as the 1857 war. But Prem Prakash Ji has, with evidence, sought to prove that it was not so. The first war of independence could actually be designated as the one that happened in 1806 at the South Indian town of Vellore, now a part of Tamil Nadu. And that was a protest against the British Empire for not allowing the Indian corps to use the puja signs, the tilak, etc. And in the rebellion that happened, almost 200 British officials got killed. There's not much of record in the history, not much written about it. Another mutiny also before 1857 was that of the 1824 in Barakpur, which of course is now a part of the West Bengal. Many of us have gone there. We still have those symbols and the monuments of that rebellion over there, where the protest was against, again, the British rulers about the discrimination and the negligence in the supplies which were made available to the Indian soldiers. Then Prakash Ji has also introduced us to some of the names never mentioned in the annals of history, and who actually gave up their lives and sacrificed themselves at the altar of freedom struggle. And some of those names, and I'm sure many in this room would be hearing them for the first time: Sohan Singh Bakhana, Bhagwan Singh, Hardyal, Kartar Singh Saroba, and also Surya Sen from Bengal, Ganesh Ghosh from Bengal, Ambika Chakravarti, Tripura Sen, Sardar Ajit Singh. Not many would be knowing was the uncle of Sardar Bhagat Singh. And even before 1857, you also had, of course, which is better known, the Mangal Pandey episode of 1849, who again was a part of the Bengal regiment in Barakpur. Then he's also mentioned about Basant Baswas, who was hanged in Ambala in 1914, Rash Bihari Bose. I think the most telling revelation or a lesser known fact sought to be brought to light by the author Prakash Ji is that of Mother Lal Dhingra, who killed Curzon on July 1, 1909 in London. There was a program going on there. He was there with his spouse. And Mohanlal Dhingra, from close quarters, shot at him and then surrendered himself. And during the trial, he refused to hire an advocate for himself. He was sentenced to death, to hang. And when he was asked to make the last statement, what he wrote, and it's been quoted very beautifully by the author, and I quote, Dhingra said, I quote, no English law or no English law court has the authority to arrest me. And he qualifies what he says by saying, if it is patriotic for an Englishman to fight against the German, if they were to occupy his country, then it is much, much more justifiable and patriotic, in my case, to fight against the English. So he was actually pointing out a contradiction in the British law itself. The British law did not hold to trial those of the Englishmen who were at that point in time agitating against the German, if at all Germans had to invade them or made them a colony. But it was treating an Indian under trial differently, in spite of the fact that he was, at that point of time, a citizen of the British Empire. And the most important fact, Congress party passes a resolution condemning Dhingra's act, dissociating itself from Dhingra. Gandhiji also unfortunately does. And for their convenience, Mohanlal Dhingra's family refuses to have any contact with him. None of the family members visits him in the prison till he gets hanged, and do not even claim his dead body. And then, and this is more important, and this is recorded on the jail manual, in the entire period of time, there was only one person who had the courage and conviction to visit him in the jail and meet him. And his name, ladies and gentlemen, was Veer Savarkar. I think after this, what has been mentioned by with a huge amount of responsibility by Prem Prakash Ji, I don't have to say anything more in response to all that is being said about Veer Savarkar by the Congress and the ilk. In fact, Prakash Ji himself sums up very beautifully on page number 117. While mentioning Savarkar, he writes, and I quote, Savarkar passed away on 26 February 1966, unsung for his fight for freedom, but maligned for his petitions for release. And in fact, petitions were done strategically to come out of the prison because he was of the belief that it was only Netaji's course of action or the option which was going to help in achieving the goal of freedom. And therefore, they could not just waste themselves away in the prison. And he was not in agreement with this, the other course adopted by Gandhi and the followers. Another quote by Prem Prakash Ji on page number 164, which I think is applicable even today, and I hope it is not tomorrow, but doesn't seem to be becoming irrelevant tomorrow. And he says that, I quote, from time immemorial, India has never lagged in providing its enemies from within, collaborators and traitors. I said, I hope it's not true tomorrow, but I'm not sure. Then he also devotes a considerable number of accounts to the hanging of Bhagat Singh on the 24th of March 1931, to Subhash Bose. And therefore, I think If you go on like this, can go on and on. But to sum up, the question after having gone through the book that needs to be addressed is, if the history that India ignored was indeed ignored, why was so? Was there a vested interest? Was there a political interest? Was there a dynastism motivating it? Was it a betrayal of the declarations made by the self-styled freedom fighters who decided to not to live up to their commitment to the nation? And finally, he's also given us a handout with the 10 events that changed the course of the history of South Asia. But I would like to, from my side, because otherwise Prakash ji would not forgive me. He would say, you just read my book and read out the phrases from there. What did you do? So, ladies and gentlemen, from my side, I would just end up saying that after reading the book, the question that arises is, why, after all, partition? And while India went through a single partition, the state of Jammu and Kashmir went through a double partition. And why the two-nation theory? And who asked for partition? There was a forum of Muslim intellectuals, Muslim writers who actually opposed it, the progressive writers reform. And both sides, in India as well as Pakistan. Sahir was one of the most vociferous opponents. Then for a while, though being the communist leaning, he chose to go to Pakistan. And then there's a famous anecdote that his companions would keep an eye on him because every day he said, I want to go back to Delhi, go back to Mumbai. And suddenly, when other companions had gone to Karachi, he quietly sneaked out of Lahore and came back to Bombay. And giving relief to his disgust, he wrote, कि वो वक्त गया, वो दौर गया, वो लोग गए इस धरती से जिनका मकसद बंटवारा था. It's a good riddance. And a few years later, Faiz, of course, who was Professor Faiz in Government College, Lahore, also echoed the similar sentiments. कि ये दाग दाग उजाला, ये शब गुज़ीदा सहर, वो इंतजार था जिसका ये वो सहर नहीं. So the two-nation theory carved out as a separate Islamic nation was not approved even by the common Muslim walking in the streets. So it was mostly the ambition of two individuals. You couldn't have two prime ministers, so one chose one for himself here, one that side. And the partition too, done in haste. Radcliffe was an attorney, was called by Lord Mountbatten, came down to London from Delhi. From London to Delhi. He stayed here just about 30 days. Was supposed to be a very intelligent attorney, got the map, got the demography, never traveled out of Delhi. He said it's not required, and I think rightly so, because he couldn't have traveled length and breadth, but he could know the population, so he drew a line depending on which community lived where, and created all this ruckus. And then, of course, he knew, and immediately after he handed over this document to Lord Mountbatten, he wrote a letter to his stepson saying that I am now coming back, and I need to leave before at least 1 million uprooted people come looking for my blood. And Jammu Kashmir, as I said, had a double partition. Of course, it was a victim of the partition which was drawn by Radcliffe near Firozpur. That side went to that side. And this side near Firozpur, Pathankot, that was the partition which divided Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir. And later, of course, when the war happened, Panditji went and announced a unilateral ceasefire, and half of the state went, which is known as now the Pak-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And that also in the immediate aftermath, in the next 2 to 3 years, followed by a series of misguided attempts to appease Pakistan. First was, of course, declaring this unilateral ceasefire just when India was on the verge of retrieving back all those areas which had been occupied by the Pakistani invaders. If they had not been made to accept the ceasefire, our forces would have retrieved that in just another 24 hours, 36 hours. The second, of course, is what is being these days discussed very widely in the media. Again, to appease Pakistan, the Indus Water Treaty of 1960. all the major rivers which had histories written around them, civilizations living around them, were handed over to Pakistan. The Indus River, the Jhelum, the Chenab, and what you were left were Satluj, Beas, and Ravi, the lesser rivers. There was so much of keenness on the part of the political dispensation of that time to keep Pakistan in good humor and buy peace, which of course again didn't happen. And same was the case with Article 370. I don't have to go into detail of that. But I think in the end I would just suffice saying that if indeed all this not happened, we had not allowed the nation to be held to ransom by the ambition of a handful of few, and if the partition could have been avoided, we would have been saved of this perpetual India-Pakistan conflict, which continues and doesn't seem to show a sign of coming to an end. We would have also been saved of this so-called Pak-occupied Jammu Kashmir. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we might have also been saved of the Pahalgam of 22 April 2025. Thank you.